So, on behalf of Kotak Investment Advisory, a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for episode 4 of Knowledge Nexus. So, as you may know, we recently launched Knowledge Nexus as a webinar series for clients of Kotak Investment Advisory. The objective of Knowledge Nexus is to invite experts in varied topics that may interest you. And today we bring to you a topic that is taking a lot of media coverage of late, and that is geopolitics. So, as you all know, Donald Trump made a return to the White House in his second term as 47th US president. Trump takes over at a time when we are in the middle of two ongoing conflicts globally, one in Middle East and the second one in Europe. So at the same time, it also appears that staging is being set for a Cold War II, this time between US and China. At the same time, it also appears that there is a possibility of escalation in Taiwan, which some believe might happen sometime in the next few years. While India, for its part, has continued its policy of multi alignment, which may just prove to be a pragmatic way forward in an increasingly multipolar world. To deep dive into these topics and more, we have just the right guest speaker with us today, Sarjan Shah. Sarjan is an expert in the fields of geopolitics, defense, history, and artificial intelligence. He received his BSc in International Relations and History from the London School of Economics in 2010, Advanced Diploma in Philosophy at Cambridge, and MBA from Harvard, both in 2016. Sarjan has also led the market entry of Peak AI, a UK-based enterprise AI platform company, and Shield AI, one of the US's most promising new defense technology businesses. Sarjan also writes on geopolitics and national security affairs for the Indian Express. Sarjan is also in discussion with the Indian government on AI based defense technologies. So, one final announcement before we start, this is a listen only webinar. So, in case you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box and we shall address them after we complete our opening remarks. So, thank you, Sarjan, for joining us today. But just before we begin, I'll just need one more minute uh, just to talk about a few things on Trump. So, Trump is unarguably the most followed person on planet Earth today. Despite that, there are a few interesting facts about him which are not common knowledge. For example, Trump was a Democrat before 1987 and an independent from 2011 to 12 before he became a Republican. As a teenager, he attended New York Military Academy where he developed his leadership skills. And lastly, Trump also has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 6 times for his businesses, but he has never filed personal bankruptcy. So these are some interesting facts about the US president. So now I will start with the most important questions we all have in mind. So the first one is that how will Trump's America First policy and foreign policy affect geopolitics and international relations?
Thanks, Vishal. And firstly, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone that's joined the webinar. I think, as you rightly said, Vishal, we're in the middle of a very interesting moment, I think, in the international system that at least someone like me, born in 1989, has experienced throughout my lifetime. And so, in order to answer your question around really what are the implications of Donald Trump on the international system, I'd probably start with the unipolar moment that ends up being created at the end of the Cold War between 1989 and 1991. And really, in order to understand what Trump might cause going forward, I'll just quickly try and summarize the world we've been living in. The world we've been living in since the end of the Cold War, Vishal, really has to be understood as a unipolar. There's one clear superpower on the planet. But the second layer to that is that that superpower has backed and created, financed, organized, and protected really a increasingly internationalized system, which is why all of us as economic participants in India and elsewhere have become increasingly a part of a globalized system. So everything that we experience, from global travel to global trade and global supply chains, is really a system that's been undergirded by the United States and the way it backs that sort of international society. And the core principle kind of hidden within all of this has always been that there are certain norms, certain rules, even certain forms of international law that even states now feel obliged to abide by as they interact with each other. Now, the reason I say all of this is that I think since the end of the Cold War, the United States has operated in a certain amount of hubris, believing that gradually the world is going to expand into its model of liberal democracy. And that experiment really has been run in what I would argue has been a Cold War 2.0 really since the rise of China began in the early 2000s, wherein as opposed to containment and an adversarial relationship, which was the model vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, the United States has pursued a model of trying to integrate with China and trying to include China into its international system, or what it considers to be its international system. In a nutshell, Donald Trump represents the end of that experiment and the commencement of really the original form of a Cold War 2.0, where what America first represents is a shift away from at least the language and the veneer of globalization, globalism, multilateralism, equal rights for nations big and small, back to very much almost, I would argue, a 19th century model of realpolitik, where it really is America willing to deploy its global and obvious power in a way that is no longer restricted or constrained by rules. So I think that is the key distinction that Donald Trump brings, where all of a sudden what all of us are experiencing in the rest of the world is a United States that has always been super powerful, limiting itself historically by the rules of behavior that it itself has created. And all of a sudden, you have a president and an administration that is looking to say that we no longer feel constrained really by most, if not all, rules that we otherwise have felt constrained by in the past. So I'll stop there, Vishal, and hand over back to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarjan. So before I ask another question, ladies and gentlemen, just one disclaimer: the views expressed over here by Sarjan are all personal and does not represent in any way views of any entity or government Sarjan is working with. So, Sarjan, coming back to the same topic, so when we say that there is a change in stance, which US might follow from here on, so what are the implications on balance of power globally and stability of the global system, which we have been used to for all these decades?
No, it's a very interesting question, Vishal, and I actually have, I think, a slightly counterintuitive view to that. I would argue that our global system, as established at the end of the Second World War, was by the last 2 decades that have just gone past, or the first 2 decades of the 21st century, was under significant strain. And the chief source of this strain, in my opinion, is the fact that that international system had ended up becoming sclerotic, badly managed, inefficient, incapable of actually resolving for a lot of the crises that the world ended up in, as well as really incapable of causing positive forward momentum in terms of the way the global structure operates. Those tensions have come to a head, and I think are now going to cause a pretty fundamental shift in the balance of power that you described. What's interesting is that I think that if I put on a Western strategic lens and then assess Donald Trump or this administration's shift in foreign policy, I'd actually argue that the West has been scoring a number of strategic own goals over the last 2 decades. And this administration might finally have brought back a certain degree of classical realism and rationality to American foreign policy. And I'll just use Russia and China, since those were the 2 nations that you mentioned, to try and draw out the point. It has been the opinion of some international relations scholars, and I'll quote Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago in particular, and I tend to agree with him on this issue, that a very sober analysis of post-Soviet Union Russian policy should lead to the inevitable conclusion that Russia has sought closer integration with and closer ties to the West. Russia has its own set of challenges vis-a-vis China, including a long simmering border dispute in Siberia. Russia, culturally and civilizationally, I think, has always considered itself to be a part of Europe rather than a part of Asia. And I only point to things like the $15 billion investment in oil and gas infrastructure, very permanent oil and gas infrastructure that Russia decided to invest in order to create Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. It simply beggars strategic logic to believe that Russia would choose to invest that kind of capex in order to build permanent oil and gas infrastructure to serve a market that it ultimately wanted to try to enter into adversarial relations with. And so instead, I think that a sober analysis of Russia since the end of the Cold War should have been that this is a swing state that, from the West perspective, if we handle correctly, we can try to make sure ends up becoming much better integrated with sort of the Western system, as opposed to the putative Chinese system. And that brings me to kind of the other power. The other side of the kind of Western own goal, I believe, has been the fact that they've managed to ignore the rising threat of China until it's almost become too late. Believing instead in their theory that sufficient capitalism and sufficient global liberal democratic pressure would ultimately somehow create a democratic capitalist China with whom the West could do business and also have civilizational relations. And what a lot of, again, political scholars have argued is that's been a fundamental misunderstanding of China. China has been happy to utilize to their own benefit both the global system as well as certain features of capitalism that they found useful, without ever losing sight of their core ideological underpinnings, which are very much authoritarian and very much communist. And so I think what the Donald Trump administration represents is a strategic realignment that recognizes that Russia isn't the great enemy, recognizes that China might be the true great adversary for the next century. And I think that that causes a fundamental shift in geopolitics that we haven't seen for a long time, because you're really talking about potentially Russia ending up being a close ally of the United States, which, and just to give you an early indication, for the first time, I think, since the founding of the United Nations, Russia and the United States voted the same way in both the UN Security Council and in the UNGA on a resolution, while countries across Europe either abstained or voted against. So we're seeing a fundamental breaking of that transatlantic relationship that may be more tactical than strategic, but we're also seeing this fundamental realignment vis-a-vis Russia and China.
Yeah, thanks, Sarjan. This is something very interesting and maybe welcome for geopolitics as well. So we already spoke about China and Russia. Another region which has been volatile for many years now is the Middle East. So what changes do you expect in US foreign policy towards the Middle East?
Yeah, look, I think that the wider Middle East is of course complicated, but if we focus on the Palestinian issue for a moment, because that's the one that's been incredibly lethal over the last couple of years. Donald Trump's taken a very controversial stance on Gaza, insofar as the physical removal of 2 million civilians is concerned. However, I do believe that this is the first time that the United States has taken a stance that is sort of almost shocking enough as to force the rest of the Arab world to ask one very important question that they have conveniently avoided asking themselves for the last, I would argue, 75 years of this conflict, which is, do we care more about that strip of land or those 2 million people? I mean, if we really believe that we have the interests of the Palestinian people at heart, given the relative population sizes, relative wealth, and relative landmass of a number of Arab nations right in the region, I think Donald Trump or the United States is trying to send a very clear signal to the Arab world that it's time that they actually do something about this problem, rather than pay lip service to it and then allow a festering conflict to continue to exist. That really leaves, more than anyone else, the Palestinian people in a horrific situation. So, I think that, again, it's this president and this administration's fundamental agility and their willingness to think outside of the box when it comes to geopolitics, to see things clearly and simply and straightforwardly and communicate kind of, what their core objectives are in a way that is incredibly transparent, that might end up having very surprising outcomes, both in terms of the conflict in Ukraine and in terms of the conflict in Israel, where you might find that a U.S. administration that is willing to flex its muscle and sort of almost force combatants to put their guns down is the fastest way to peace.
Okay. So again, talking about these two conflicts between Russia, Ukraine, and Iran, Israel. See, Trump had promised that he will put an end to these conflicts or wars very quickly, and of course, he has been working towards that also as well. So what, in your view, should we be expecting? Would there be a temporary pause in these kind of conflicts, or we can have a long-lasting peace, which the world has not seen over quite a number of years now?
I mean, look, I very, very hard to predict. And obvious to everyone, I'm sure, is the fact that the overall trajectory, say, over the last 2 decades, again, if you measure from, say, 1989 to 2001, when 9/11 happened, and then 2001 to today, uh, what's clear is that low intensity conflicts have continued to kind of exist as a permanent feature of our system. And a full spectrum of adversarial actions occurring across powers, again, continues to be a permanent feature of the system. Everything from espionage and industrial level reverse engineering through to targeted assassinations and or other forms of subconventional conflict. I mean, all of this seems to be a permanent feature of the system, despite all of the polite language that diplomats speak with each other. But also, what we've seen clearly is a increasing likelihood of state-on-state conflict, with the threshold for armed conflict seeming to reduce over time rather than go up. And again, I'll give you the example of our own country. I think maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would all have thought it unthinkable for India to conduct airstrikes across the border. And the thinking back then used to be that the Pakistani nuclear deterrent is such that merely because they've said we will respond with a nuclear attack to any form of armed aggression from India, sort of precludes India from doing something like an airstrike, because we're concerned that the Pakistanis might actually launch a nuclear war. And what the Modi government did was played through that kind of game theoretic model and said, no, we're going to call your bluff. We don't think that you're going to escalate to the nuclear threshold, and we are going to launch airstrikes. Now, why that is super interesting is that it's the first time that two nuclear powers have said, oh, we might have a conventional war even in the presence of nuclear weapons, which is something that is kind of unthinkable because of the original theory of mutually assured destruction. That if you have nuclear weapons, conventional warfare kind of goes out of the window because either side can just use nuclear weapons. Same thing with Russia, right? I mean, if you consider Ukraine to be a sort of proxy war with Europe behind it, France is a nuclear power, Russia is a nuclear power, and you have a situation where you effectively have a conventional war despite the existence of nuclear weapons. So all of that to say, unfortunately, nothing is trending towards lesser conflict in the world. Everything is trending towards more conflict in the world. We're definitely seeing a retreat of global norms. The power and relevance of multilateral institutions and organizations is at a low ebb. Global confidence that those institutions add any value at all, is at a historic low. Nations are recognizing that there's a wider degree of freedom and that the norms that were kind of unwritten seem to have much less power than they did even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So, growing up, I think that we all believed that the international system was going to get more and more closely integrated. Globalization was this inevitable process. Everyone was going to end up doing diplomacy and business rather than war and espionage. And really, for the last 20 years, it's kind of reversed course, and everyone seems to be interested in war and espionage over, sort of diplomacy and business. All of that to say, can Donald Trump shift this? Well, again, look, we can assess his specific strategies, say in Ukraine, in order to try to achieve a peace deal there, or in Israel, in order to achieve a lasting peace there. And very happy to get into that if you'd like to. But overall, it's a very difficult thing to do, I think, even for the US president to try and create permanent conditions for peace, would be my overall answer.
Yeah, thank you, Sarjan. So one more thing, when we talk of alternatives to superpower status of US, BRICS was proposed as a solution to that a long time back. Then BRICS tried to become BRICS Plus when they invited a lot of other countries to join BRICS. But Trump administration has recently given direct threats to these countries that of tariffs if they move ahead with any kind of de-dollarization plans. So under the current regime, what do you think? Will BRICS be relegated to a very small kind of organization or a bloc, or it will still thrive under Trump administration?
Look, okay, let me try and describe what I think is going to happen in terms of the overall structure, because I think a lot of Indians like to talk about this shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, right? Because we all hope that we are going to become one of the poles. So let me try and answer the question from that perspective, and I'll address BRICS. As I said, I think we've been in a unipolar system for at least the last 20, 25 years. I think we're now in the middle of a transition for sure. The question in my mind is, are we transitioning into a multipolar world, or are we transitioning into a second era of the bipolar world of the Cold War 1.2, right? So it's not necessary, if you ask me, Vishal, given the existing power structure in the world, that we end up with multipolarity. It is also entirely likely, or at least possible, that we end up in effectively two blocks. And they may not be equal blocks, they may be very asymmetric in their size and relative power, but they will be blocks that would end up creating separate, distinct, holistic systems where everything from civilian, use technology through to defense use technology, and everything from cost, food and energy supply chains all the way through to, language and entertainment is sort of maintained in a block, right? So, and I think that this will unfold over the next decade. This is the way the US handles itself, the way China handles itself, the way all the other nations respond. So one thing to keep in mind is we're not guaranteed a multipolar system. We might be forced into a new bipolar system. And what that implies for us from an Indian standpoint, Vishal, is super interesting, because you mentioned, and I think you mentioned correctly, and I called this the Jaishankar Modi doctrine when I wrote about it in the Indian Express. But we seem to have developed, to replace our old sort of Soviet era, Nehruvian era non-alignment, we seem to have come up with this idea of multi-alignment. And a multi-vector relationship with the world is, I think, the phrase that our foreign minister uses. Now, when pushed on what that really means during a foreign tour, he made a very interesting point. He said, so the way the question was framed for him was, but surely, Minister, India can't be all things to all people, right? That's the way the question was framed to him. And he said, no, let me be clear. Multi-alignment doesn't mean we are all things to all people. It means we are ourselves to all people. And so really what he was trying to say is that it's not that we are merely transactional, merely mercantilist, merely looking at everything as a kind of game theoretic interaction and only interested in our national interests. We also believe in some values. So there are some core civilizational values that we hold dear, and India will consistently maintain those values across its relationships. Now, that's fine as it goes. The challenge is, if we end up in a situation, and Donald Trump, I think, might be a significant forcing function on this question of what situation we're in. If we end up in a situation where the world is heading back into bipolarity, before, sooner rather than later, India is going to be forced to answer the question of which camp are we in. And we can use all sorts of diplomatic niceties to avoid calling ourselves an ally and using the word partnership and using secure supply agreements rather than defense contracts and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, there are going to be powerful signals that we need to send to the world as to which camp we're in the moment these camps start to get created. And that's when this new doctrine that India is trying to follow is really going to get tested. If we end up genuinely becoming powerful enough to say we are our own bloc, that's a whole other question. If you do a very sober analysis of where we are and what we've done over the last 75 years, have we developed enough self-sufficiency in defense? Have we developed enough self-sufficiency in technology? Are we food and energy secure? Have we managed to already develop regional hegemony over Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Burma, at least Myanmar, I should say? Then one could argue, if we had done all of these things over the last 75 years, that, okay, India might end up being its own pole. But with where India is at the moment, reality is that we are significantly behind the two superpowers on this planet, and much more likely than not that we might be forced into making a choice of this block or that, as opposed to continuing to sit on the fence. So I think that's when this new Modi Jaishankar doctrine is going to get tested by dint of the structure that ends up developing.
Yeah, that's right. I agree that we are way behind, these two so-called superpowers in terms of technological innovation. So coming to India-US relations, Modi's visit to US, I mean, whatever we could see on the media, that the meeting was not as visibly cordial as what we saw the last time when Modi visited US. So, do you see, some kind of change in stance which US is taking? Because this is quite opposite to what generally public was thinking before Trump came in. Because we had a good relation with the Trump administration earlier. So, is there any impact on US-India relations in this new administration?
No, look, I think my assessment net is that the Trump administration net will be a positive for India. Of course, there's many a slip between cup and lip. The active negotiations that uh, and something like a Trump administration immediately requires India to manage. It's really important that we handle those negotiations intelligently. And what I mean by that, Vishal, is that in the various gives and takes across the full spectrum of issues that can be discussed by nations when America is in the mood to do like a comprehensive bilateral set of agreements, which is what they announced an intention to do when the Prime Minister went there. It's a very complex negotiation. And the responsibility of our diplomats really has to be not to drag our feet and dig our heels in and say, no, this is what our policy is and this is the core national interest, but instead try to think creatively around what are the maximal gives that we can offer versus what are the critical asks that we must have from the Americans across a number of issues. And can we find some complementarity between our core national interests and their core national interests? I think India and the US have an enormous opportunity, Vishal, to be honest, thanks to a deep commonality that I believe both civilizations have at the level of values, right? Whether you call it democracy, whether you call it individual freedom, whether you call it diversity. I think that India and the United States have incredible civilizational, foundational, values-based ties, and I think that that's a real sign that, given everything else we've just discussed about where the world might be going, India and the United States getting its partnership right might be one of the most important things for a better, safer world in this century. If we don't get it right for some reason, because we don't handle the negotiation correctly or something goes wrong, I think that that's a net loss for the world as well, by the way. That said, I think that what we're experiencing is the general shift on global trade that you're seeing from the Trump administration across allies and partners all over the world. And unfortunately, India is among the top 5 countries that the US does run a trade deficit with. I think that it's more interesting to assess what Donald Trump and this administration are doing with global trade, and then maybe view what they're doing in relation to India in that context. I think what they're doing is a part of this kind of shift into Cold War 2.0. They're adding a strategic layer to the question of who trades with who. They're saying this is not purely an economic question. I don't only care about what the market thinks is the most profitable arrangement, right? I mean, the old model was the economists are clear that there are gains from trade. Therefore, trade is a good thing. Therefore, in our march towards globalization, we're going to end up with these highly specialized economies. The classical example being England produces wool and Portugal produces wine. And instead of both people doing both things, why can't we just do the thing that we're good at and then share with each other, and both people get better wool and better wine and better prices, right? That's the pure model of gains from trade. Donald Trump is, I think, announcing to the world, this administration is announcing to the world that the reality is that there are strategic considerations that go beyond pure gains from trade. And the United States is no longer willing to follow purely an economic or a financial model on this question of how we approach, or how the United States approaches, the global economy. Instead, I think the United States is going to end up prioritizing joint and integrated supply chains, joint and integrated market access, a very well coordinated mutual tariff policy with countries that are of strategic importance. This is really important, Vishal. He doesn't care where you don't have strategic importance to the United States, but where you do, you could end up in all sorts of complex arrangements with the US as a part of an overall deal, as he likes to call it, right? So the best way to interpret everything he's trying to do is effectively to, rebalance some injustices that he sees in the world in terms of mutual access to markets and what they're calling reciprocal trade. But I think that the theme really is there is now a strategic layer to a trade conversation. And before this, there used to be much more of a pure business approach to a trade conversation, where The Americans were confident that their companies were competitive enough that they didn't need any barriers. The rest of the world believed that their companies were not, and everyone accepted that there would be asymmetric trade barriers. And Donald Trump saying that's fine as it goes, but I'm going to start to like change that decision based on who you are. So Ukraine will be dealt with very differently because of the unique circumstances that the US finds itself in with Ukraine. India will be dealt with very differently because of the unique circumstances that India and the US occupy.
Okay. Okay, the next one is on global defense spending. So Trump's stance has been very different on defense spending and military alliances. So do you foresee there'll be a significant jump in defense spending globally?
Again, this is all speculation at this point. The best interpretation of what Donald Trump is trying to do is whip his European partners and allies into shape so that they start sharing their burden of the load of defending Western civilization. And while he's doing that, it's very interesting. You'll notice, Vishal, that Trump or JD Vance or any of this administration will not lecture India on human rights, freedom of speech, those sorts of cultural norm issues, ever. This administration will never do that. But they will go and lecture on exactly those issues of freedom of speech, for example, and cultural issues to their European allies. And the difference is only that they consider the European allies to be a part of Western civilization. Anyone that's outside of Western civilization, we don't have to have an ideological conversation with. But if you're also Western, I'm going to have an ideological conversation with you. Why are you banning free speech in your country or whatever, issues that the US Republicans now have with European liberals. So the reason I mentioned that is Donald Trump is, I think, trying to force Europe to take on its fair share of its own defense, so that Donald Trump can focus all of the United States' defense funding on containing and deterring China. He'd like to end the Russian threat so that Russian spending, European spending, and American spending can all be focused on countering and deterring China. I think that he actually intends to create conditions that are stable enough from a long-term peace deal that you'll see an increase in defense spending in order to drive this message of deterrence. And then you'll see an eventual tapering off of defense spending as actually people realize that, wow, this peace is stable. And the best pathway, and I hope that he ends up doing all of this. There's also a whole interpretation that this administration has lost the plot and is not going to achieve anything at all. But the best version of events is kind of in a step-by-step domino. He makes Europe wake up. He secures assets for the United States in Ukraine, which implies a security guarantee because now there are American assets in Ukraine. So Putin knows better than to continue any war with Ukraine. He secures not only a peace deal, but introduce Russia also into some sort of an economic arrangement or partnership in and to do with Ukraine. Slowly but steadily, he starts to reintegrate Russia with the West. India makes certain decisions in relation to its own foreign policy. And you end up in a situation where Xi feels contained enough that Xi decides that China might as well do a grand bargain with the United States rather than continue down this path of sort of adversarial relations and threatening an invasion of China and threatening the Philippines and so on and so forth. So in an ideal world, Donald Trump just does a series of deals and everyone truly does go back to just doing business and diplomacy rather than war and espionage. But as I say, anything could go wrong. The international system is incredibly unpredictable. And you could end up triggering a sort of, chain reaction of events that ends up in a very, very different place.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. This is something which the world would definitely like to happen if Russia and US, or Russia becomes part of Europe, and we see a more peaceful environment. One question again which has propped up after Trump came is what is the fate of multilateral institutions like the UN and WTO? Will they gradually fragment and decline, or will they be able to address global crisis in future?
Again, it's a great question, and unfortunately, my answer will be very speculative, given we're only at the first month of the Trump administration. But I'll say two things. I'll say there's always a risk, as they say, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So, yes, a certain amount of reform in each of these institutions was necessary. things like UNRWA in relation to Palestine was a total catastrophe. Certain arms of the United Nations were extremely badly managed. The overall rating as an organization, if you were to assess the UN or any of its orgs, the way a company would assess itself on efficiency and effectiveness in achieving its outcomes, they would fail every KRA or KPI. Highly inefficient, known to be extremely corrupt, known to kind of cause massive leakage in the resourcing that's available. So all of those issues are real, don't get me wrong. That said, I don't think that anyone should want to just get rid of multilateralism or get rid of forums where nations can have conversations and enter into agreements and plan for cooperative action. And so, I think, and this is India's stance as well, we've always been proponents of fundamental reform of these institutions, right? Whether it's in terms of the UN Security Council seat structure and the fact that that doesn't represent the 21st century, but represents the 19th century, many would argue, in terms of the 5 permanent members, or indeed many of the other issues that we felt in relation to the UN. So we've always been in favor not of sort of getting rid of multilateral institutions, but instead causing fundamental reform. I can't judge where Donald Trump is on that question or where the Trump administration is on that question. I think it's unlikely that they believe that the whole of the UN and like multilateralism per se is a relic that is no longer useful. I think that they are much more likely to be in favor of a radically reformed set of multilateral institutions that are more purpose-built and designed to achieve actual outcomes and help solve for complex global challenges, which undoubtedly exist in the 21st century, right? So hopefully that's the direction that the Trump administration takes things in. If they decide that they want to take a big axe to all of these institutions, then again, we live in a very, very different world where I think you'll start to see those norms breaking apart even further and nations believing that they can take certain action without really expecting any kind of globally coordinated response in relation to such action. And that just means that a number of simmering conflicts all over the world could end up erupting. So, hopefully that's not the path that we're on.
Okay, so now coming back to India, so we over the years we have seen some degree of instability across all our neighbors, be it Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and very recently Bangladesh. So how do you think India is preparing for this kind of volatile neighborhood?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by how is India preparing. There's many, many, many different ways at which you have to prepare. There's many, many different thresholds that one has to achieve. Ideally, one wants to be somewhere, and then there's the realities and constraints of where we are. So I don't want to give you a very vague answer, Vishal. So are there any specific elements that you're interested in an assessment of?
Okay, so I'll ask another thing on the same matter. So recently we saw a tweet by Mr. Piyush Goyal wherein he mentioned that he has been in discussion with Shield AI on potential partnerships. So in your discussions with Indian policymakers, what have your key takeaways been, or what according to you are the top 3 things on the minds of foreign policymakers in India today?
Look, fortunately, I think that we have an excellent foreign intelligence and defense establishment. There's real competence and care across at least those arms of our government, and all of my interactions over the last 4 or 5 years have been, have continued to reinforce that. The major thrust of our discussions, really, with government, to the extent that I can comment on them, are around the revolution in military affairs that we are currently seeing kind of unfold live in Ukraine. And that revolution really is like any revolution in military affairs that has occurred through history. And RMAs are a thing that are, sort of structure that are studied by historians. In any RMA, really what you have is a number of subcomponent technologies converge at a particular point, allow you to develop some sort of system for the battlefield, which ends up kind of wholesale transforming the way war is conducted. And I believe we're in the middle of that exact sort of revolution once again. This time, the revolution is defined really by 2 categories of technology, Vishal. Unmanned systems across the board, so across all 4 domains, air, land, sea, space, and their attendant autonomy software. And by autonomy software, I mean true autonomy, genuine human out of the loop decision making. So Elon Musk recently attended a event at West Point which is the US military academy, and he was asked a question about the future of the battlefield. And to quote him, he said, "It consists of drones and AI." And so the sort of broad structure of future air forces, future ground forces, future naval forces that India needs to start thinking about immediately is replacing large, expensive, exquisite technology platforms like a Sukhoi 57 or an F-35 with a much larger number of pilotless, unmanned, AI piloted, much less expensive, deployed in a much larger number sort of force structure. So you have this concept of disaggregated mass, distributed ISR, a network battlefield, and I'm very happy to share that it's highly likely that we'll end up, by we, I mean, I don't know whether India will get here, but at least the world will see entirely AI piloted fighter aircraft very, very soon. The technology has matured, and we're about there, which means that there's an enormous opportunity for India, Vishal, to make the right decisions today to make sure that instead of continuing down the paths that we have of still trying to develop a fourth generation fighter while the Chinese have deployed their sixth generation fighter, they've already deployed 1,200 J-35s, which are fifth generation fighters. India is now talking about buying the F-35, which is now a fighter aircraft that costs over $100 million a piece, which means that if we have to afford even half the fleet size that the Chinese have, that would be a $60 billion acquisition, which I simply, is unaffordable for India. And so the opportunity really for India, Vishal, at this point is to get onto the right part of the tech tree, to do what we have, for example, with mobile telephony, but with a number of other types of technology. Skip a couple of generations, right? India never achieved 100% desktop penetration and then 100% laptop penetration and then 100% mobile penetration, which is what the US has done. We said nothing, and then we went straight to mobile tech. And I think in the same way, if we play our cards right, we might be able to circumnavigate or solve this problem of how do we ever afford to catch up with China and the rest of our adversaries by trying to focus entirely on battlefield autonomy and unmanned systems.
That is helpful. So before I open up for question and answers, I'll just ask one more question from my side. So US is now talking of setting up a sovereign wealth fund. So how do you see this evolving? Is this more of a financial or maybe a strategic initiative which Trump is talking about?
I have no idea, Vishal. I mean, the US economic system, their deficit, their debt, the role that the dollar plays, and now in the middle of all of that, you throw in a sovereign wealth fund. Where does that money come from? Who owns it? What are its terms? It's all completely TBD. I mean, honestly, it's a breakneck speed with this administration. Every day I wake up to saying, what happened overnight? Let's see. One day it's the golden green card. One day it's, Gazaria. One day it's the Gulf of America. One day it's he'd like Greenland. So it's very much TBD. I think that the idea broadly, and I am very supportive of this, is that this administration wants to become incredibly rational about US government finances. Whether it is Doge internally, whether it is how money is used globally, whether it is how the United States protects its own interests, they really are looking to conduct that wholesale internal reform to make sure that US financial and fiscal stability is preserved, which I think is great news for the global system in the long term. Because at the end of the day, the global economy depends on continued, US financial viability. So I would read things like the Sovereign Wealth Fund as one among many initiatives designed ultimately to cut the American deficit, generate maximum value from every dollar that the American government spends, and sort of maximize long-term American fiscal viability.
Thanks, Sarjan. So I would request participants to type their questions in the Q&A box. So I already have a couple of questions, Sarjan, so I'll start taking them one by one. So the first question is that what if countries follow some countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Saudi, they form a similar approach as India and come together and becoming one pole and take more neutral stances continuously.
Sorry, so I think that question implies sort of either an expansion to BRICS or another organization like BRICS. I'll try and answer your earlier question on BRICS, which I actually didn't cover. Look, I don't think that groups like BRICS have ever had much relevance or significance for the simple reason that you've had a very odd grouping of countries. You know, the only thing they had in common was that they were not the West, right? That's really what India, China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa had in common with each other. Given what we've just talked about in terms of the gap between China and the other four members in the BRICS, or indeed the fact that China has border disputes with two of the other major members of the BRICS, combined with the fact that BRICS has never had a strategic or defense or technology component to it at all. At best, it was sort of a coordinated voting bloc for the purposes of the UN. And I think it's more of a relic of an era where there was still that sense of the global South needs to unite against the West, and the South being the poorer parts of the world, and China and India sort of, bye at the level of being kind of poor post-colonial powers. It's just all pretty irrelevant at this point, right? So I don't know about that. And as far as countries like Indonesia or in Southeast Asia are concerned, again, like if you look at the fault lines in the world, Ukraine is one major fault line because Russia as a swing state meets Europe. The other big fault line is really where the West meets China, the Asian superpower, is all over the Southeast Asian archipelago, right? So that region, right from Japan in the north, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, all the way down to the island chain that goes to Australia. This is a real hotspot as far as China is concerned. And so all of these nations and the direction that they swing in and whose equipment they buy and with which military they have interoperability, these are going to be key questions going forward. But I think you're going to see in America that's like coming in to like make sure that all of that goes in one direction now. And the incredible opportunities if India is clearly on one side of that equation, and if Russia is clearly on one side of that equation, again, you go back to that theme about isolating China and keeping them contained effectively on their shoreline by building a very tight system of alliances right there. At the moment, I would argue that those countries are as influenced by China, if not more, than the United States or the West, right? But when you start to combine the influence of the US, the influence of India, which is a very trusted kind of middle power by these smaller countries, and the influence of Russia, which has been selling military equipment to a lot of these countries for a long time, then I think you have a much more compelling reason for those nations also to say, okay, let's join this bloc as opposed to continue to try to be influenced by China.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the next question, it says that technological supremacy has been the biggest soft power for US, but with DeepSeek, that has been effectively challenged by China. So is this signaling a tectonic shift actually pointing towards the US exceptionalism coming to an end?
DeepSeek was huge. Don't get me wrong. It does have deep implications. It has deep implications for the global AI value chain. I think it has a lot of implications for capital and for the providers of capital in terms of which parts of the AI value chain are really going to end up creating and capturing maximum long-term value, and which subparts might become commoditized. I don't think that I would stretch the implications to affecting US exceptionalism overall. Simply put, the brutal reality is that the US is exceptional. The way I phrase it, God bless them, not only to win the last century, but also to win the next one. They have won in a globalizing world. They will continue to win in a deglobalizing world unless, again, they score own goals of their own, like domestic issues and cultural issues and things like that. And the reason I say that is that they have everything. They have geostrategic security. They have total food and energy sufficiency. They have the world's greatest tech ecosystem, which will respond immediately to what DeepSeek has done. So I come back to DeepSeek. They have the world's greatest capital markets. They continue to attract the world's greatest talent. In fact, if the US opens up the floodgates for talent, the real risk for the rest of the world is that the rest of the world might never develop because all of the greatest talent in the world ends up being filtering to the US. So America has some incredible advantages, especially if they play their cards right. Now let's try to understand that from the perspective of DeepSeek. So what DeepSeek did was, and the app doesn't matter. Even the underlying model weights, which have been specifically published, don't matter. What really matters is the math and the AI techniques that they published in the academic paper that they chose to open source as well. So they open source two things. They published in a scientific journal the innovative AI techniques that they had used both in training and inference in order to achieve the incredible efficiency at an architectural level that they had. And separately, they actually released the model weight itself in order to make DeepSeek specific conversational model available widely and for free anywhere in the world. Now, let's understand, I think it's obvious to everyone what the release of the model weights did. Immediately, it kind of called into question ChatGPT and OpenAI's business model. It called into question whether large language models and foundational models would end up being commoditized, and whether, in fact, a large chunk of the AI value chain's value had shifted downstream to the application layer, i.e. the layer beyond a general purpose foundational model that allows you to do something specific with AI. So that's a business implication. But at the strategic level, it's the math underlying that really made everyone kind of take up, stand up and take notice, which is people, I think, had forgotten in the West that a lot of innovation can still be done purely at the level of the mathematics and at the level of AI techniques that allow you to create far more efficient AI architecture that requires much less compute and therefore much less cost, both for training and for inference. Now, what happens the moment that light bulb kind of flashes in the West is that you've got this incredible innovation ecosystem, incredible pool of talent that is going to immediately start doing that, whether it's the universities and academia or a number of startups or your existing AI majors. Everyone's going to start to drive costs up. So it's, I would say, net great news for the world, because AI is going to become very affordable. So we can all enjoy AI agents in our lives, and an increasing array of products and a whole taxonomy of AI agents will get developed because training them and deploying them becomes much more affordable. It is great news for NVIDIA and other chip makers. I think demand continues to surge because all of these applications will need it. It's slightly bad news for NVIDIA because a lot of the lower end sort of applications now may not need the best NVIDIA chips. So only the most advanced AI applications will require the best NVIDIA chips, and a lot of other second-tier chip makers might be able to meet some of the demand in the market as well. And then, lastly, I think that you're going to end up in a situation where the United States will outcompete China because of the speed of its innovation and the freedom that ecosystem generates. And so long story long, I guess, I don't think that DeepSeek challenges US tech dominance fundamentally. It's just caused this incredible explosion of further innovation all over the world to commence.
Yeah, that's quite insightful. Actually, I have a couple more questions, but since you have a hard stop, I think that would be the last one we would take. So with that, we wrap up episode 4 of Knowledge Nexus webinar. Thanks a lot, Sarjan, for taking time out for this. This was indeed a very timely and insightful session. And thank you so much to all the clients for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next month once again for episode 5 of Knowledge Nexus webinar. Thank you once again, and have a good day.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you all. Thanks, guys. Thank you.